The Salty Anchor Tavern in Port Royal reeked of rum, salt, and broken dreams. Its weathered walls had witnessed 1,000 tales of maritime glory, but none quite like the story of James Sullivan, though most knew him by a far less flattering name. "Driftwood!" bellowed Captain Bartholomew Iron-Tooth McGrath, his voice cutting through the tavern's din like a cutlass through silk. "Still nursing that single mug of ale, are ye? Waiting for a ship to wash up on shore like a piece of, well, driftwood?" Laughter erupted from the surrounding tables, where captains and crews celebrated another successful raid. James sat in his usual corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a pewter mug that had seen better decades. At 35, he possessed the knowledge of a master navigator, the tactical mind of an admiral, and the respect of absolutely no one. "Leave him be, McGrath," called out Captain Elena Scarlet Storm Vasquez from across the room. "Every port needs its cautionary tale." More laughter. James had heard it all before. The jokes about the sailor without a ship, the master mariner reduced to odd jobs and tavern tales. 5 years ago, he'd been first mate aboard the Crimson Tide, one of the most feared vessels in the Caribbean. Then came the storm that changed everything. "Tell us again, Driftwood," sneered Captain Blackjack Morrison, his gold teeth glinting in the lamplight. "How'd you lose your ship? Was it incompetence or cowardice?" James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The truth was more complicated than these fools could understand. The Crimson Tide hadn't been lost to storm or battle. It had been sacrificed. James had chosen to ram a Spanish treasure galleon to save a village of innocent fishermen from bombardment. The ship went down, taking the treasure with it, but 200 lives were saved. His captain hadn't seen it that way. Neither had the crew. They'd branded him a fool and a traitor, leaving him stranded in Port Royal with nothing but his reputation in ruins. "Maybe he's waiting for the Pirate King to rise from the dead and grant him a ship," suggested Captain Mad Dog Henley, earning another round of guffaws. "Or maybe," said a new voice from the tavern's entrance, "he's waiting for the right moment to show you all what real seamanship looks like." The laughter died as every eye turned toward the speaker. Captain Marcus Redbeard O'Malley stood in the doorway, his crimson beard catching the light like fire. Behind him stood his first mate, Thomas Silent Tom Chen, and Quartermaster Isabella the Raven Blackwood. The crew of the Seawolf commanded respect throughout the Caribbean. They were Corsairs, not pirates, operating under letters of marque from the English crown. "Redbeard," McGrath said cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you in port." "Emergency council," Redbeard replied grimly, his eyes scanning the room. "Every captain in the Caribbean needs to hear this. We've got trouble coming, the kind that'll make our petty squabbles look like children's games." He strode to the center of the tavern, his presence commanding immediate attention. 3 days ago, my scouts intercepted Spanish communications. Admiral Diego Mendoza is assembling the largest treasure fleet in history. 40 galleons, 20 warships, carrying enough gold to buy half of Europe. Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. Such a fleet would be the prize of a lifetime. "But here's the catch," Redbeard continued. "Mendoza's not just transporting treasure. He's planning to use that fleet to establish permanent Spanish control over every major port in the Caribbean, starting with Port Royal." The tavern fell silent. Spanish control meant the end of the freewheeling Corsair lifestyle, the end of English letters of marque, and quite possibly the end of their lives. "When?" asked Captain Vasquez. 2 weeks, maybe less." Redbeard's expression was grim. "Mendoza's assembled this fleet in secret, using ports we didn't even know existed. By the time our spies confirmed it, he was already moving." "So we hit them before they reach Port Royal," suggested Blackjack. "Coordinate our fleets, strike hard and fast." "With what?" Redbeard laughed bitterly. "Mendoza has 60 ships. Even if we could unite every Corsair captain in the Caribbean, which we can't, we'd be lucky to field 30 vessels, and half of those would run at the first sign of real trouble." The captains began arguing among themselves, voices rising as panic set in. Some suggested fleeing to other ports, others proposed negotiating with the Spanish, and a few even mentioned surrendering outright. It was then that James Sullivan stood up. "You're thinking about this all wrong," he said quietly. The tavern fell silent again, but this time the silence was hostile. McGrath sneered. "Oh, look who's found his voice. The man without a ship wants to give us tactical advice." "Actually," Redbeard said, studying James with new interest, "I'd like to hear what he has to say. James Sullivan was first mate on the Crimson Tide before. He knows these waters better than any of us." James felt every eye in the tavern upon him. This was his moment, perhaps his only chance to prove that he was more than just driftwood. "You can't beat Mendoza in a straight fight," he began, his voice growing stronger. "But you don't need to. The Spanish treasure fleet has one critical weakness. It's too valuable to risk." "Explain," Redbeard commanded. James moved to the center of the room, his mind already working through the tactical possibilities. "Mendoza's fleet is massive, but it's also slow and unwieldy. Those treasure galleons are loaded to the waterline. They can barely maneuver. The warships have to stay close to protect them, which limits their tactical options." "So?" Blackjack challenged. "So you don't attack the fleet," James continued. "You attack their supply lines, force them to split up, make them choose between protecting the treasure and completing their mission." Captain Vasquez leaned forward, intrigued. "How?" James smiled for the first time in months. "The Spanish fleet has to stop for water and supplies. There are only 3 ports between here and their staging area that can handle ships that size: Tortuga, Nassau, and Havana. We can't take Havana, too well defended. But Tortuga and Nassau, you're talking about coordinated raids on fortified ports," Mad Dog Henley protested. "That's suicide." "Not raids," James corrected. "Blockades. We don't need to take the ports. We just need to make them unusable. Sink a few ships in the harbors, destroy the water supplies, force Mendoza to send his warships ahead to clear the way." The tavern buzzed with excited conversation as the captains began to see the possibilities. But McGrath wasn't convinced. "Even if that works," he said, "we're still talking about facing Spanish warships. And who's going to coordinate all this? You?" He laughed mockingly. "The man who lost his ship to save a bunch of fishermen?" The insult hung in the air like smoke. James felt the familiar shame rising in his chest. But then he saw something unexpected, respect in Redbeard's eyes. "Actually," the red-bearded captain said slowly, "that's exactly why he should coordinate it. James Sullivan didn't lose his ship through incompetence or cowardice. He sacrificed it to save innocent lives. That tells me more about his character than a dozen successful raids." "Character doesn't win battles," McGrath snarled. "No," agreed Redbeard, "but it wins loyalty. And loyalty wins wars." The debate continued for hours, but gradually more captains began to see the wisdom in James's plan. By dawn, they had the framework of a strategy that just might work. But as the meeting broke up, James found himself alone with Redbeard and his officers. "You know, this is a long shot," the red-bearded captain said quietly. "Everything worth doing is a long shot," James replied. "But it's better than running or surrendering." "Agreed. But there's one problem with your plan." Redbeard's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. "You can't coordinate a naval campaign from a tavern stool. You'll need a ship." James's heart sank. "I don't have—" "You do now." Redbeard clapped him on the shoulder. "The Sea-Wolf is yours to command for this operation. My crew and I will serve as your officers." "But why?" "Because 5 years ago, you proved you're willing to sacrifice everything for what's right. Today, you proved you have the mind to turn that sacrifice into victory." Redbeard extended his hand. "What do you say, Captain Sullivan?" James stared at the offered hand, hardly daring to believe it. After 5 years of mockery and shame, someone was offering him not just redemption, but command. "I say," he replied, grasping Redbeard's hand firmly, "let's show the Spanish what Caribbean Corsairs can do when they work together." As word spread through Port Royal that Driftwood Sullivan had been given command of the Sea-Wolf, reactions were mixed. Some captains grumbled about following a man without a ship, while others remembered his reputation from the old days. But all of them recognized the desperate nature of their situation. Over the next 3 days, James threw himself into preparation with an energy he hadn't felt in years. He studied charts, calculated supply routes, and planned contingencies for every possible scenario. The Sea Wolf became a floating headquarters as captains came and went, receiving their assignments and coordinating their movements. The plan was ambitious. 12 ships would hit Tortuga, 15 would blockade Nassau, and the remaining vessels would form a mobile reserve to exploit whatever opportunities arose. It required precise timing, flawless communication, and more luck than any sane sailor had a right to expect. "Think it'll work?" asked Isabella Blackwood as she watched James plot courses on the chart table. "It has to," he replied without looking up. "Because if it doesn't, we'll all be dead or in Spanish chains within a fortnight. And if it does work?" James finally looked up, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then maybe they'll stop calling me Driftwood." But the morning of departure dawned clear and bright, with a steady wind from the southeast. 27 ships prepared to leave Port Royal, the largest coordinated Corsair fleet in Caribbean history. As the Sea Wolf led the formation out of the harbor, James stood at the bow, feeling the salt spray on his face and the deck rolling beneath his feet. For the first time in 5 years, Captain James Sullivan was where he belonged, at sea in command, with a crew that believed in him and a mission that mattered. The Spanish treasure fleet was still out there, still coming, but now they would face more than just scattered pirates and desperate corsairs. They would face the united fury of the Caribbean's finest captains, led by a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come from the greatest sacrifices. The real test was yet to come, but as the fleet spread out across the azure waters, James felt something he hadn't experienced since that fateful day 5 years ago. Hope. The attack on Tortuga came at dawn, swift and merciless as a Caribbean squall. Captain James Sullivan stood on the quarterdeck of the Sea Wolf, watching through his spyglass as 12 Corsair vessels executed his plan with precision that would have impressed any admiral. "Fire ships away," called Isabella Blackwood from the port rail. 2 old hulks, loaded with pitch and gunpowder, sailed into Tortuga's harbor like floating funeral pyres. The Spanish garrison's cannon roared in response, but it was too late. The burning vessels crashed into the harbor's mouth, their hulls settling into the shallow water to create an impassable barrier. "Harbor's sealed, Captain," reported silent Tom Chen. "No ship larger than a fishing boat is getting in or out of there." James nodded grimly. Phase 1 was complete, but the real test lay ahead. According to his calculations, Admiral Mendoza's treasure fleet would reach these waters within 3 days. When they found Tortuga unusable, they'd have to choose: send warships to clear the harbor, or proceed to Nassau and hope for better luck there. "Signal the fleet," James commanded. "Form up and head for Nassau. Time to see if the Spanish take the bait." The 15-ship Nassau force had already departed, led by Captain Elena Vasquez. If James's timing was correct, they'd be implementing the same strategy at Nassau's harbor, just as Mendoza's scouts discovered the situation at Tortuga. As the Sea Wolf cut through the azure waters, James found himself thinking about the past 5 years. The mockery, the shame, the endless nights wondering if he'd made the right choice when he rammed that Spanish galleon. Now, commanding a fleet of Corsairs in the most ambitious naval operation in Caribbean history, he finally had his answer. "Sail ho!" came the cry from the crow's nest. "Spanish colors, bearing northeast!" James raised his spyglass, his heart racing. 3 ships, fast frigates flying the banner of Admiral Mendoza, scout vessels most likely, sent ahead to assess the situation at Tortuga. "They're turning back," observed Redbeard, who had insisted on serving as James's first mate for this operation. "Heading back to report to Mendoza." "Good," James replied. "Let them see what we want them to see. Signal the reserve fleet. It's time for Phase 2. The next 18 hours were a masterclass in naval misdirection. James positioned his ships to give the impression of a much larger force, using signal fires and false flags to suggest Corsair vessels where none existed. When Mendoza's scouts returned with their reports, they would tell their admiral that the Caribbean Corsairs had assembled a massive fleet. but they wouldn't know where that fleet was planning to strike. The answer came at sunset the following day, when the horizon filled with sails. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," whispered Thomas Chen, staring through his spyglass at the approaching armada. "There must be 60 ships out there." Admiral Mendoza's treasure fleet was a sight to behold. Massive galleons, heavy with gold and silver, surrounded by sleek warships bristling with cannon. It was the largest concentration of Spanish naval power ever assembled in the Caribbean, and it was heading straight for Nassau. "Signal from Captain Vasquez," reported the ship's signalman. "Nassau harbor is sealed. Spanish advance guard is attempting to clear the blockade." James smiled grimly. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Mendoza had taken the bait, sending his warships ahead to clear Nassau while keeping his treasure galleons safely in the rear. But the Spanish admiral was about to learn that the Corsairs had one more surprise waiting for him. "All ships," James commanded, "prepare for battle. We're going after the treasure galleons." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. While Mendoza's warships were occupied at Nassau, James intended to strike at the heart of the treasure fleet with his 27 Corsair vessels. It was David versus Goliath, but David had the advantage of surprise and desperation. The attack began at midnight, under a moonless sky that turned the sea black as ink. The Corsair ships approached in complete silence, their crews having muffled every piece of metal and covered every light. James had learned this tactic from the old pirates. Sometimes the best weapon was the enemy's own complacency. "There," whispered Isabella, pointing toward a cluster of lights in the distance. "The treasure galleons. They're anchored in formation, just like you predicted." James studied the enemy formation through his nightglass. 12 massive galleons arranged in a defensive circle, with smaller escort vessels patrolling the perimeter. It was a strong formation, against a conventional attack. But James wasn't planning anything conventional. "Remember," he told his crew, "we're not here to sink them. We're here to capture them. Those ships contain enough treasure to buy freedom for every Corsair in the Caribbean." The first phase of the attack was pure stealth. 6 small boats, each carrying a dozen men, slipped through the darkness toward the Spanish perimeter. Their mission was simple: eliminate the sentries and signal fires that would alert the main fleet to the attack. James watched through his spyglass as dark shapes moved across the enemy ships like shadows. One by one, the Spanish signal lanterns went dark. The perimeter guards simply disappeared. "Phase 1 complete," reported Silent Tom. "The way is clear. Signal the attack," James commanded. What followed was unlike any naval battle in Caribbean history. Instead of the thunderous broadside exchanges that typically characterized ship-to-ship combat, this was a silent, deadly dance of boarding actions and close-quarters fighting. The Corsairs swarmed over the treasure galleons like pirates of old, but with a discipline and coordination that spoke to James's tactical genius. Each ship had specific objectives: secure the treasure holds, capture the officers, neutralize resistance without alerting the distant warships. James himself led the assault on the flagship, a massive galleon called Santa Isabella that served as Admiral Mendoza's treasure vault. As he swung across the gap between ships, cutlass in hand, he felt the old thrill of combat coursing through his veins. The Spanish crew fought bravely, but they were caught completely off guard. Within an hour, 11 of the 12 treasure galleons had fallen to the Corsairs. Only one escaped, its captain managing to cut anchor and flee toward Mendoza's main fleet. "Treasure secured," called Captain McGrath from the San Miguel. The same man who had mocked James in the tavern now followed his orders without question, having seen the results of his tactical brilliance. "All ships, prepare to withdraw," James commanded. "We've got what we came for." But as the Corsair fleet began to organize its retreat, laden with captured Spanish treasure, a new problem emerged. The escaped galleon had reached Admiral Mendoza's main force, and now the Spanish warships were racing back from Nassau, their cannon already booming across the water. 20 warships bearing down on us," reported the lookout. "They'll be in range within the hour." James studied the tactical situation with the calm precision that had made him legendary. His Corsairs were heavily laden with treasure, making them slower and less maneuverable. The Spanish warships were faster and more heavily armed. In a straight fight, the outcome was inevitable. But James Sullivan hadn't survived 5 years of mockery and shame by accepting inevitable outcomes. "Signal all ships," he commanded. "Abandon the treasure galleons. Transfer the most valuable cargo to our fastest vessels and prepare to scatter." "Sir?" Isabella looked confused. "We're abandoning the prize?" "We're saving the fleet," James corrected. "The treasure is worthless if we're all dead." It was a heartbreaking decision, but a necessary one. The Corsairs worked frantically to transfer chests of gold and silver to their own ships, taking only what they could carry while maintaining speed and maneuverability. The captured galleons were set adrift, their holds still heavy with Spanish treasure. As the Spanish warships closed in, James made his final gambit. Instead of fleeing in a scattered formation that would allow the enemy to pick off individual ships, he ordered his fleet to form a single column and head directly toward the most dangerous waters in the Caribbean, the Devil's Triangle. "Captain," Redbeard said quietly, "those waters have claimed more ships than the Spanish Navy." "Exactly," James replied, "which means Mendoza won't follow us there. He can't risk his remaining treasure ships in those waters." The chase that followed became the stuff of legend. 27 Corsair vessels, laden with Spanish gold, racing through treacherous waters, while 20 Spanish warships pursued them to the edge of the Devil's Triangle. The Spanish admiral, faced with the choice between pursuing the Corsairs into deadly waters or protecting his remaining treasure, chose discretion over valor. As the Spanish fleet turned back, the Corsairs found themselves alone in the vast expanse of the Caribbean, richer than they had ever dreamed and alive against all odds. "Signal from the fleet," reported the signalman. "They're requesting permission to return to Port Royal." James nodded. "Granted. And signal Captain Vasquez. Tell her to break off the Nassau blockade and rendezvous with us at Port Royal." The return to Port Royal was triumphant beyond anything the Corsairs had ever experienced. Word of their victory had preceded them, and the harbour was lined with cheering crowds as 27 ships sailed into port, their holds heavy with Spanish treasure. But it was what happened that night at the salty Anchor Tavern that would be remembered for generations. As James entered the establishment where he had endured 5 years of mockery, every conversation stopped. 300 Corsairs, captains, officers and crew members from the victorious fleet, were packed into the tavern and spilling out into the street. Then, slowly, Captain McGrath stood up. The man who had called him Driftwood just weeks before raised his mug high and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the tavern. "To Captain James Sullivan, the man who united the Caribbean Corsairs and showed the Spanish that these waters belong to free men." The response was thunderous. 300 voices joined in the toast, and then someone began to sing, an old sea shanty that had been modified for the occasion. Oh, they called him Driftwood, said he had no ship, but he led 300 Corsairs on a treasure-hunting trip. From Tortuga to Nassau, his plan was bold and true. Now the Spanish know the power of the Caribbean crew. One by one, every Corsair in the tavern joined the song, their voices rising in harmony that could be heard throughout Port Royal. James stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the moment he had dreamed of for 5 years. Captain Redbeard appeared at his side, grinning broadly. "Well, Captain Sullivan, I think it's safe to say they'll never call you Driftwood again." James looked around at the faces surrounding him, men and women who had followed him into impossible odds and emerged victorious. These weren't just Corsairs anymore. They were his fleet, his family, his legacy. "No," he agreed, raising his own mug to join the toast. "From now on, I think I'll just be Captain Sullivan." The song continued long into the night, growing louder and more elaborate with each verse. By morning, every sailor in the Caribbean would know the story of the man who had been mocked for having no ship, only to command the greatest Corsair fleet in history. And in the years that followed, when young sailors asked about the legendary Captain Sullivan, the old Corsairs would smile and tell them about the night 300 voices rose in the salty Anchor Tavern to sing the name of the man who had proven that true leadership comes not from the ship you command, but from the courage to do what's right when everything is at stake. The Spanish treasure fleet never returned to Caribbean waters. Admiral Mendoza was recalled to Spain in disgrace, and the dream of Spanish dominance over the Caribbean died with him. The Corsairs, united by their shared victory, continued to work together, protecting the free ports and maintaining the balance of power that kept these waters free. And James Sullivan, no longer driftwood but simply captain, sailed these waters for many years to come, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the ships we command, but from the respect we earn and the loyalty we inspire. The song of the 300 Corsairs echoed across the Caribbean for generations, a reminder that in these waters, a man's worth is measured not by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for others.